Who was the violin collector Antonio Antoncich? Now, there is something rather fascinating about individuals who have risen from obscurity to gain fabulous wealth and riches and have then been able to indulge in their passion for collecting fine instruments. And Antonio was one such a man. Many of the famous collectors have been lords or nobility or people with wealth already, but here we have a case of somebody who rose almost from nothing to become quite powerful and thus had the means to acquire a fantastic collection of instruments. So let's do a deep dive into who this man was and what happened to his fine instruments. First, let's get the pronunciation right. I believe it's pronounced Antonio Antoncich Cralietto. So what do we know about Antonio Antoncich Cralietto? He was born into a modest family in a small Croatian fishing village, Violins, on November the 22nd, 1868. By the time of his death in 1955, he had amassed one of the greatest collections ever of stringed instruments in South America and had contributed significantly to the development of European musical culture in Chile. Antoncich was born into a musical family. His uncle, Vittorio Cralietto, was a music teacher in Violins and probably introduced the young Antonio to music and gave him lessons. Antoncich's younger sister, Costanza, was a singer who trained in Trieste and Milan and hoped to sing at La Scala, but died of consumption before she could realize her dream. His grandniece, Luisa Scrivani, recalls that Antoncich was proud and determined, but in life, Violins was quiet and there was little opportunity for such an ambitious man. Twice Antoncich tried and failed to leave Croatia. He first emigrated to Trieste to work for the shipping company Österreichischer Lloyd, but was dismissed for poor performance. Then around 1890, he and his younger brother Federico booked a third-class passage on a steamer bound for New York. While Federico made his way in America, less than a year later, a disheartened Antoncich returned to Violins, complaining that America was cold and unwelcoming. On his third attempt, he left Dalmatia and arrived in Valparaiso, Chile in 1892. Integration there was easier for Antoncich than it had been in New York. At the end of the 19th century, there was a large Croatian community in Valparaiso, and obtaining Chilean citizenship was straightforward for immigrants from the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Once a small village, by the 19th century, Valparaiso had been transformed into an important port city. Known as the Jewel of the Pacific, Europeans flocked to the flourishing city and left their mark on its architecture and culture. Like many port towns in the New World, it was a city of beginnings where new and old cultural identities blended and were celebrated. Resolved to succeed in South America, Antoncich found work with the Compañía de Salitres y Ferrocarril, a mining company in Antofagasta in the north of the country. The company's main products were saltpeter or nitrates, which were used to manufacture fertilizer, gunpowder, and in food preservation. By the end of the 19th century, Chile was responsible for nearly 80% of the world's nitrates, giving it a monopoly over the production of this white gold. By 1910, its per capita GDP was the 15th highest in the world, almost equal to that of France and Germany, and greater than that of its former colonial ruler Spain. Antoncich rose quickly through the ranks of the company and in just 4 years was made a director. Through his work he became friends with Pasco Babarica Soletic, a fellow Croatian who had arrived in Chile the same year as Antoncich. The two developed a lifelong friendship in addition to their business interests and shared a nostalgia for the culture of their homeland. In 1910, Babarica founded a mining company of his own, Babarica & Co., which would later control 30% of Chile's nitrate mines. Antoncich would come to own shares in the Babarica company, which would prove key to his financial success. In the 1910s and 20s, it was boom time for nitrate mining in Chile. With this came financial success for Antoncich, which he used to enrich his life with music. He began to play the violin again and took weekly lessons. His wife Amanda played both the piano and guitar and sang romantic songs with a very sweet voice. Soon Antoncich's home became the unofficial concert hall at Valparaiso, and with very few exceptions, put on live concerts every Monday evening between 1918 and 1937. Encouraged by the triumph of his salon and flushed with financial success, Antoncich began to invest in instruments. His first significant purchase was the Naryshkin Antoncich Bergonzi of 1743-47, which he acquired during a trip in Europe in 1922. He bought the violin from W.E. Hills and Sons for £600, using the Babarica company as his intermediary. The year after he bought the Bergonzi, he acquired his second and third instruments, the Guarneri and a Stradivari. Upon their arrival in Valparaiso, they were immediately put to use in a recital that evening featuring the pianist Maria Dvorak, the niece of the Czech composer. Unfortunately, these two instruments would later prove problematic for Antoncich. The violin ascribed to Giuseppe filius Andreae Guarneri had been sourced for Antoncich by the Babarica Company secretary in London, John S. Wood. A problem arose when Antoncich noticed an inconsistency between the date on the label of the violin and the date written in the certificate. In itself, this is hardly a cause for alarm, but seems to have developed into a crisis for Antoncich when his friends doubted the authenticity of his new trophy. He asked if he could address the issue with Arthur Beer. "I shall thank you if you can some way correct that discrepancy so as not to let my friends doubt the genuineness of the violin." The Stradivari violin that Antoncich had also purchased that year was the 1699 Camposelice. The Hills had known this violin since 1887, having sold it 3 times. This time it was Beer who sold the violin to Antoncich through Wood on the recommendation of an unnamed violinist. The £2,200 that Antoncich paid in 1924 represented a hefty markup from the £950 that Bonvalot had paid 4 years earlier in 1919. Antoncich's next purchase consisted of a cello by Sebastian Villaume and a viola by Lupo, both acquired locally in November of 1923. And at the end of the year he bought a 1712 Grancino cello, an 1829 Rivolta viola, a Grancino violin, a Torz cello bow, and a Voirin, a viola bow, again through his agent John Wood. To Wood he wrote, "I am becoming an incorrigible collector. If sales of nitrate improve, I intend to acquire a good Joseph del Gesù, possibly an instrument of historical importance, something like the Saint and Guarnerius Hill offered lately. You may tell them this so they may see it as in their interest to treat me well." From 1924 onwards, he transacted primarily with the Hills. In 1924, he bought a Tecular cello, in 1651 Nicola Amati, and in December a double bass by Pierre Sylvestre dated 1850. That same year he also imported a custom-made pipe organ from Gebruder Lenkfirm in Germany, which he had installed in his music room. As the reputation of his music soirees grew, so did the audience size. Wanting to accommodate larger crowds and ensembles, Antoncich bought his neighbour's house in 1925. In doing so, he was able to double the capacity of the salon and benefit from the use of a separate entrance. He also in 1925 added 3 exceptional instruments to his collection: the Primrose Lord Harrington Guarneri Viola, the 1735 Antoncich Ward Guarneri del Gesù, and a 1747 Guadagnini. He liked to rub elbow with important musicians and made his home a destination for European musicians on tour, including Claudio Arrau, Willy Burmester, and many chamber ensembles. On June 27, 1926, Antoncich hosted the London String Quartet who were touring South America. Antoncich's purchases slowed after 1926 as his fortunes were greatly diminished owing to the recession in the nitrates market. The last 2 instruments he acquired were the Henry IV Amati viola and a violin by Giovanni Battista Rogeri, which he acquired from the hills during a trip to Europe in 1935, in part exchange for the Camposelice Stradivari. In the years that followed, Antoncich slowly removed himself from this world, and the weekly concerts in his home had ceased by 1937. His wife died in 1941. The means by which Antoncich's collection was dispersed are not fully understood. The Bergonzi remained in Chile until 1975. The Guarneri viola had arrived in New York by the early 50s. The Amati viola was purchased by US Navy Commander Edgar K. Thompson and was later sold by Sotheby's in 1981. The Guadagnini appeared at auction in 1989. The current whereabouts of the Tequila, Rivolta Grancinos, the Amati, and the alleged filius remain unknown. Antoncich, who had long suffered from Parkinson's disease, passed away in 1955. What about the Casa Antoncich? Well, it's still there. Don Antonio Antoncich's house on Cerro Alegre in Valparaiso, Chile, was one of the most important musical halls of the first decades of the 20th century. So I'm sure you'll agree that was an interesting account about a self-made rich man from a humble poor background who rose up to become powerful in the mining industry in Chile, used his wealth to accumulate a sizable collection of antique Italian instruments, and some German instruments as well in the mix. and even a French cello, I believe, was then overtaken by events, ended up losing his collection, and the collection was dispersed. Sadly, some of the instruments, we no longer know where they are. But this is not the only case of a great collection having been lost due to financial reversal. And it is a shame in a way that the house, the casa, does not contain any of the instruments this day. In other words, that it's not become a violin museum. But nevertheless, a fascinating story and a fascinating collection of violins indeed.